In November 1941, one frozen rail junction decided whether 3 million people would live or starve behind the walls of Leningrad. The battle for Tikhvin was not fought for territory, but for the last artery of survival. If this line fell, the siege would not be measured in years, but in weeks. The Battle of Tikhvin unfolded within the broader framework of Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on 22 June 1941. By early September, German Army Group North had advanced more than 800 kilometers from the Baltic frontier to the outskirts of Leningrad. The city, with a pre-war population of approximately 3 million, was the second largest in the Soviet Union, and one of its most critical industrial, political, and symbolic centers. Its fall was expected by the German High Command to deliver a decisive psychological and strategic blow to Soviet resistance in the north. Germany's strategic objective in the northern sector in 1941 was not only the capture of Leningrad, but the destruction of Soviet forces defending it. The plan envisioned a rapid encirclement of the city through coordinated advances along the Baltic coast and the southern shores of Lake Ladoga. By cutting all land communications, German command intended to isolate the city, force its collapse through starvation and bombardment, and thereby eliminate the Soviet Baltic fleet and major industrial capacity in the region. By September 1941, Leningrad was already under near-complete land blockade. German forces controlled the southern approaches, while Finnish forces, advancing from the north, had reached the pre-Winter War border but halted short of direct assault on the city. The only remaining supply route to Leningrad ran across Lake Ladoga. With the onset of autumn, this route became vulnerable to airstrikes and artillery fire, and its capacity was insufficient to sustain the city's full population and garrison. The town of Tikhvin, located approximately 200 kilometers east of Leningrad, became central to the struggle for survival of the city. Tikhvin was a major railway junction linking the Volkhov River line with the interior railway network leading toward Vologda and Moscow. This rail corridor formed the backbone of the last overland supply route feeding Leningrad. If German forces captured Tikhvin and cut this connection, the Soviet command would lose its final reliable means of delivering food, fuel, and ammunition to the besieged city before the freezing of Lake Ladoga. By October 1941, the strategic situation for the Soviet Union was severe across the entire Eastern Front. German Army Group Center and South were advancing toward Moscow and deep into Ukraine, respectively. Industrial evacuation from western regions was still incomplete. The Red Army had suffered losses exceeding 3 million men killed, wounded, or captured since June. Despite this, Soviet leadership prioritized the defense of Leningrad as a political necessity and a strategic anchor, tying down substantial German forces that might otherwise be deployed elsewhere. German Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, consisted primarily of the 16th and 18th Armies and had suffered mounting casualties since the summer. While still operationally coherent, its formations were increasingly stretched, with extended supply lines running back through the Baltic states. By mid-October, German infantry divisions in the sector averaged 8,000 to 9,000 men, well below their authorized strength of approximately 17,000. Armored strength was limited, and most mobile formations had been reassigned earlier to support operations toward Moscow. Public sentiment in Leningrad during the autumn of 1941 was shaped by mass evacuations, food ration reductions, and continuous artillery bombardment. By September, daily bread rations had been reduced to 500 grams for workers and 300 grams for dependents. Civilian mortality from hunger and exhaustion had begun to rise even before winter conditions set in. At the same time, industrial production continued under emergency conditions, with factories converted to wartime output while under shell fire. On the Soviet military side, the defense of the Tikhvin axis fell primarily to the Volkhov Front, officially formed in December, but already operational under earlier provisional command structures. Its task was to block further German eastward advances beyond the Volkhov River and protect the rail approaches linking Leningrad to the Soviet interior. Soviet forces in this region in early October numbered approximately 190,000 to 210,000 men, supported by limited armor and artillery, much of it newly assembled from hastily mobilized reserves. By late October 1941, all strategic conditions had converged to make Tikhvin a focal point of the struggle for Leningrad. For Germany, its capture promised the final severing of the city's lifeline. For the Soviet Union, its defense became inseparable from the survival of Leningrad itself. The stage was set for a battle whose outcome would determine whether the blockade would become a death sentence or a siege that could still be sustained through winter. The opening phase of the Battle of Tikhvin began in early October 1941 as German Army Group North initiated renewed eastern thrusts following the stabilization of the Leningrad siege line. The operational objective was to extend the German advance beyond the Volkhov River, seize Tikhvin, and sever the final rail artery supplying Leningrad from the Soviet interior. This task was primarily assigned to the 39th Motorized Corps under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, operating within the framework of the 16th Army. German offensive movement toward Tikhvin commenced on 8 October 1941. Advance units pushed eastward from the Emga and Kirishi areas through forested and swampy terrain with limited road infrastructure. Initial opposition came from forward elements of the Soviet Fourth Army and parts of the 52nd Army, which were understrength and in the process of reorganization following earlier defensive battles. German forces achieved daily advances of 10 to 15 kilometers during the first week, exploiting weak Soviet field fortifications and gaps between newly formed defensive units. By 14th October, German forward detachments approached the Volkhov River line. Soviet engineers had destroyed several bridges, forcing German units to conduct improvised crossings under artillery fire. Despite these obstacles, German infantry secured multiple bridgeheads by 16th October, supported by concentrated artillery and limited armored support. German casualties during the river crossing phase are estimated at approximately 2,500 to 3,000 killed and wounded, while Soviet losses during the same period exceeded 6,000 due to the exposure of incomplete defensive positions. The Soviet command responded by urgently reinforcing the Tikhvin axis. Rifle divisions were redeployed from the Leningrad defensive belt and from interior reserve formations. Rail transport moved thousands of troops eastward despite constant Luftwaffe attacks on rail junctions and rolling stock. By 20th October, Soviet troop strength in the Tikhvin sector had increased to approximately 230,000 men, though artillery and armored support lagged behind due to transport bottlenecks. German forces reached the western outskirts of Tikhvin on 23 October 1941. The city at that time had a pre-war population of approximately 60,000 and contained multiple industrial workshops, rail depots, and warehouses storing supplies intended for Leningrad. Local Soviet authorities attempted emergency evacuation of industrial equipment and civilians, but only partial success was achieved due to limited rail capacity and air attack. Approximately 25,000 civilians remained in the city by the time German assault units approached its outer defensive perimeter. Initial fighting on the approaches to Tikhvin took place between 24 and 30 October. German infantry units conducted repeated frontal attacks supported by artillery and engineer detachments tasked with clearing obstacles and minefields. Soviet defenders consisted of ad hoc defensive groupings formed from regular rifle divisions, militia units, and detached naval infantry from the Baltic Fleet Reserve. The urban defensive perimeter relied on hastily constructed trenches, barricades, and anti-tank ditches rather than permanent fortifications. On 8 November 1941, after nearly 2 weeks of sustained assault, German forces entered Tikhvin from the northwest and west. Street fighting continued for more than 48 hours, as Soviet units attempted localized counterattacks around key railway installations and industrial zones. By 9 November, German command declared the city secured. During the capture of Tikhvin, German casualties are estimated at approximately 4,500 killed and wounded. Soviet losses during the defense and abandonment of the city reached approximately 9,000 to 11,000 killed, wounded, and missing. The immediate operational consequence of Tikhvin's fall was the severing of the last overland rail connection supplying Leningrad. The Volkhov-Tikhvin-Vologda railway line was cut entirely along a front of more than 40 kilometers. German artillery began registering fire on nearby Soviet transport nodes, while Luftwaffe units intensified air interdiction against remaining logistics infrastructure east of the city. For German command, the capture of Tikhvin appeared to realize the long-sought objective of completing the land blockade of Leningrad. For the Soviet leadership, it triggered an immediate emergency response. Orders were issued to prepare a counteroffensive regardless of weather conditions, supply limitations, or casualty risk. With winter approaching and Lake Ladoga not yet fully frozen, the fate of Leningrad now hinged on whether Tikhvin could be recaptured before the city's remaining supply network collapsed under sustained isolation. Strategic goals and planning for the Battle of Tikhvin took shape under extreme time pressure and severe operational constraints on both sides in late October and early November 1941. For the German High Command, the capture of Tikhvin was intended to finalize the isolation of Leningrad by cutting the last functioning railway supplying the city from the Soviet interior. The objective was not merely territorial control, but the physical severing of the Volkhov-Tikhvin-Vologda rail corridor, which carried food, fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements to the besieged metropolis. German planners calculated that without this artery, Leningrad's remaining supply routes would be insufficient to prevent large-scale starvation and collapse of organized resistance. Army Group North integrated the Tikhvin operation into its broader siege strategy for Leningrad. The operational burden fell on the 16th Army, particularly the 39th Motorized Corps, supported by elements of the 28th and 12th Infantry Divisions. These forces were tasked with maintaining pressure eastward, despite the growing logistical strain caused by the length of German supply lines, which now extended more than 700 kilometers from the German border. Fuel delivery to forward units was increasingly irregular, and ammunition consumption during the October battles had already exceeded forecast levels by more than 30% in several divisions. German planning assumed that the Soviet defense east of the Volkhov River would lack operational depth. Intelligence assessments underestimated the speed with which the Red Army could regroup reserves from the interior and from the Leningrad defensive zone. German command also failed to account for the cumulative effect of terrain and climate. The Tikhvin region consisted of dense forests, swamps, and limited road infrastructure, with autumn rains already degrading mobility. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night by late October, turning unpaved roads into alternating mud and ice corridors that severely constrained mechanized transport. On the Soviet side, the strategic objective was the restoration of the rail connection to Leningrad at any cost. The State Defense Committee prioritized the Tikhvin counteroffensive alongside the defense of Moscow, despite the critical situation on multiple fronts. The Volkhov Operational Group, later formalized as the Volkhov Front, received emergency reinforcements drawn from Siberian reserve units, interior military districts, and formations withdrawn from secondary sectors of the Leningrad defense line. These transfers were executed under continuous German air attack on rail junctions at Vologda, Cherepovets, and Volkhovstroy. Soviet planning emphasized speed over preparation. The goal was not immediate destruction of German forces in Tikhvin, but the rapid disruption of their supply base and the re-establishment of rail access within weeks rather than months. Soviet commanders accepted severe risks in terms of exposure, incomplete artillery preparation, and limited coordination between newly assembled units. Between 1 and 15th November, more than 130,000 Soviet soldiers were redeployed into the Tikhvin counteroffensive grouping, supported by approximately 160 tanks and over 1,000 artillery pieces and mortars. Logistical planning for the counteroffensive was conducted under conditions of scarcity. Artillery ammunition stocks were limited, and fuel allocations for armored units were often sufficient for only 1 or 2 days of continuous operations. Winter clothing and medical supplies lagged behind troop concentrations. Soviet transport planning relied heavily on horse-drawn logistics and human portage through forest corridors where vehicles could not operate reliably. German planning within Tikhvin after its capture reflected a defensive posture rather than preparation for further deep advance. The city was converted into a forward supply base and strongpoint. Rail infrastructure was partially restored under fire to enable limited east-west movement. Warehouses seized in the city provided temporary relief for German provisioning. Defensive belts were established around Tikhvin using trench networks, barricades, and anti-tank obstacles, with the expectation that Soviet counterattacks would be limited in scale due to perceived exhaustion. Strategic miscalculation defined both sides at this stage. German command overestimated the finality of the rail cutoff and underestimated the Soviet capacity for rapid winter counteroffensive. These advances were conducted with limited artillery preparation due to ammunition shortages. Soviet rifle divisions attacked in battalion and regimental groupings, supported by light tanks and direct-fire artillery. Progress during the first 48 hours was limited, with advances of only 1 to 3 kilometers in selected sectors. German forward units responded with concentrated machine gun fire and rapid counter-battery artillery response. German defensive deployment around Tikhvin relied on hastily constructed trench lines and converted urban positions rather than prepared fortresses. Infantry regiments were stretched thin over wide forest sectors, often holding 2 to 3 kilometers of frontage per battalion. German anti-tank defense was based on 37mm and 50mm guns positioned along forest roads and narrow clearings, supported by mobile assault gun detachments transferred from neighboring sectors. Between 11 and 16 November, Soviet forces intensified localized attacks against German supply lines feeding into Tikhvin. Small assault groups targeted road junctions, bridgeheads, and rail repair teams operating under German engineer protection. In multiple engagements near the villages of Budagoszcz and Shugozerka, Soviet detachments temporarily severed German forward supply corridors for periods ranging from 6 to 18 hours. These interruptions increased German ammunition shortages in the city and forced greater reliance on aerial resupply under worsening weather conditions. Civilians remaining in Tikhvin were exposed directly to combat conditions. Artillery exchanges inside the city damaged rail depots, power stations, and residential districts. Between 10 and 20 November, Soviet civil defense records estimate that more than 1,200 civilian deaths occurred as a result of shelling, air attacks, and lack of medical treatment. German occupation authorities attempted to organize limited food distribution using seized stocks, but these measures proved inadequate under continued combat pressure. On 17 November, Soviet forces achieved their first operational breakthrough south of Tikhvin along the Smerdina Road corridor. A composite force of 2 rifle divisions and a tank brigade penetrated the German defensive screen to a depth of approximately 7 kilometers, threatening the main German supply route into the city. German command reacted by redeploying reserve battalions from the northern sector and committing remaining mobile elements to halt the advance. After 2 days of fighting, the Soviet penetration was contained, but German supply traffic into Tikhvin was reduced by more than 40% over the following week. Casualties during the first engagement phase were substantial on both sides. Between 10 and 20 November, Soviet losses in the Tikhvin counteroffensive sector are estimated at approximately 18,000 to 22,000 killed and wounded. German losses during the same period are assessed at approximately 9,000 to 11,000 killed and wounded. Most engagements involved infantry, artillery, and small-scale armor actions, rather than large mechanized formations. Morale fluctuated sharply during this early clash phase. German troops initially regarded their hold on Tikhvin as secure due to the presumed isolation of Leningrad. However, repeated Soviet assaults under deteriorating weather conditions and growing supply difficulties began to erode confidence. On the Soviet side, the immediate results of the counteroffensive were limited in territorial gain, but the ability to contest German control of the rail corridor restored operational momentum at a critical moment. By late November 1941, The battle had entered a new stage. The initial Soviet attacks had confirmed that German forces around Tikhvin were tactically extended, logistically strained, and unable to establish a deep defensive system before winter set in fully. The front line stabilized temporarily amid forested terrain and expanding snow cover, but both sides were now committed to escalation under conditions that would soon transform the struggle into a battle of endurance rather than maneuver. The escalation and crisis phase of the Battle of Tikhvin unfolded from late November into the first half of December 1941, as both sides expanded the scale of combat under rapidly deteriorating weather and logistical conditions. After the initial Soviet breakthroughs failed to dislodge German forces from the city, Soviet command ordered a general intensification of offensive operations along the entire Tikhvin sector. The objective shifted from local disruption to the systematic collapse of the German forward grouping through continuous pressure on its extended supply lines. By 23 November, temperatures in the Tikhvin region fell consistently below 10 degrees Celsius at night. Snow depth increased rapidly, further limiting movement to a small number of forest roads and frozen tracks. These conditions sharply reduced German transport efficiency. Fuel deliveries to Tikhvin dropped by more than 50% compared to early November levels. Daily food rations for German frontline troops were reduced, and ammunition resupply became irregular, with artillery batteries frequently limited to a few dozen shells per gun per day. Soviet forces used the growing German logistical paralysis as the basis for renewed large-scale attacks. Between 26th of November and 3rd December, coordinated assaults were conducted from the north, east, and south of Tikhvin by elements of the 4th, 54th, and 52nd Armies. These attacks involved multiple rifle divisions supported by tank brigades and massed artillery. Preparatory barrages, though shorter than those used in earlier summer battles, reached concentrations of up to 150 artillery pieces per kilometer of front in selected sectors. German defenses began to show signs of structural strain. Infantry regiments defending the outer perimeter reported effective strengths reduced to 50–60% of October levels due to casualties, frostbite, and sickness. Several units were holding defensive fronts of more than 6 kilometers with fewer than 2,000 men. Assault gun detachments used as mobile fire brigades were forced to redeploy continuously between threatened sectors, dramatically accelerating mechanical wear and fuel exhaustion. A critical escalation occurred on 1 December 1941, when Soviet forces achieved a partial rupture along the northern approaches to Tikhvin, near the village of Berezovik. After penetrating German trench lines to a depth of 8 kilometers, Soviet units threatened to sever the primary east-west supply road feeding the city. German command responded by committing its last operational reserve, including elements of the 12th Infantry Division and assault gun batteries withdrawn from the southern sector. After 4 days of continuous fighting, the German counteraction restored partial control of the corridor, but at the cost of severe losses in both infantry and remaining mobile assets. Inside Tikhvin, the situation evolved into a localized urban supply crisis. Rail infrastructure was no longer fully usable due to repeated Soviet artillery strikes on switching yards and track junctions. German aerial resupply attempts increased, but were limited by weather and Soviet air defense. Between 25 November and 5 December, only an estimated 30% of scheduled air transport sorties reached the city. As a result, German field hospitals reported shortages of bandages, surgical supplies, and winter clothing. Frostbite cases among German troops inside and around the city exceeded 4,000 by early December. Soviet losses during the escalation phase also mounted rapidly. Continuous frontal assaults against forest fortifications and urban strongpoints inflicted heavy casualties. Between 26 November and 5 December, Soviet killed and wounded in the Tikhvin sector are estimated at approximately 35,000 to 40,000. German losses during the same period are assessed at approximately 16,000 to 20,000 killed, wounded, and missing. The casualty imbalance reflected the higher exposure of attacking Soviet infantry against entrenched German positions. Despite growing weaknesses in German logistics, civilian conditions deteriorated to a critical level. By early December, organized food distribution in Tikhvin had largely collapsed. Remaining civilians relied on improvised shelters, foraging, and limited aid from Soviet advanced detachments operating on the outskirts. Mortality from cold, hunger, and untreated wounds increased sharply. Contemporary Soviet medical reports compiled after the city's recapture later documented several thousand civilian deaths during the occupation period. By the first week of December 1941, the battle around Tikhvin had entered a full operational crisis phase for both sides. German forces retained control of the city, but faced mounting isolation, collapsing supply capacity, and shrinking combat strength. Soviet forces had not yet achieved a decisive breakthrough, but their persistent pressure had destabilized the German defensive system and created multiple vulnerable corridors. The battle was now approaching its most decisive stage, where endurance, rather than maneuver, would determine the fate of the Tikhvin corridor and the survival of Leningrad's last lifeline. The peak of the Battle of Tikhvin unfolded between 6 and 15th of December 1941, when both sides committed their remaining operational reserves under conditions of extreme cold, deep snow cover, and near-total logistical exhaustion. This period marked the most intense and decisive phase of the entire campaign, as Soviet command concentrated its final effort to break German control of the city and reopen the rail corridor to Leningrad before the full collapse of winter supply alternatives. On 6th of December, Soviet forces launched a coordinated general assault against the entire German defensive arc around Tikhvin. The main order was directed from the east and northeast, where elements of the 4th and 54th Armies advanced in multiple assault groupings. The Soviet strike force for this phase included approximately 100,000 to 110,000 troops, supported by around 120 tanks and more than 900 artillery pieces and mortars. Due to ammunition scarcity, preparatory barrages were limited in duration but dense in concentration, lasting 25 to 40 minutes per sector. German defenders at this stage consisted of exhausted remnants of the 39th Motorized Corps, with effective frontline strength reduced to approximately 45,000 to 50,000 men. Armored support had dwindled to fewer than 20 operational assault guns in the immediate city defense zone. Artillery units were restricted to minimal defensive fire due to near-complete ammunition depletion. In several battalions, daily small arms ammunition allotments were issued on a per-engagement basis rather than through standard supply distribution. Between 6 and 10 of December, Soviet assault groups achieved successive penetrations along forest corridors northeast of the city. Infantry units advanced through knee-deep snow, often bypassing strong points rather than attempting frontal reduction. On 19th December, Soviet troops reached the final German supply road feeding into Tikhvin from the west. This route came under direct machine gun and mortar fire, reducing transport flows into the city to negligible levels within 48 hours. Urban fighting resumed inside Tikhvin itself on 10th of December. Soviet forward detachments entered the eastern industrial district and rail yard sector after German positions collapsed under converging pressure. Street-to-street combat spread across the warehouse zones, tram depots, and power station perimeter. German defenders conducted localized counteractions, using remaining assault gun sections and infantry platoons consolidated from multiple regiments. These counterattacks temporarily restored several blocks of territory, but failed to stabilize the front. On 12th December, German command recognized that further defense of Tikhvin was no longer operationally viable. With the supply corridor effectively severed, fuel stocks exhausted, and medical evacuation halted by snowstorms and Soviet artillery fire, continued resistance inside the city risked encirclement of the entire forward grouping. Orders were issued for a phased withdrawal westward under cover of darkness and artillery screening fire. The German withdrawal began on the night of 12 to 13 December. Rearguard units conducted delaying actions along key exit roads, while demolition teams destroyed rail infrastructure, fuel depots, and remaining supply stocks. The retreat unfolded under continuous Soviet pressure. Several withdrawal columns became disorganized in forest zones south of the city and were partially overrun by advancing Soviet infantry. On 13 December 1941, Soviet forces re-established full control over Tikhvin. By 15 December, Cleanup operations continued west of the city as German rear guards disengaged toward the Volkhov River line. Soviet losses during the peak phase between 6 and 15th December are estimated at approximately 28,000 to 32,000 killed and wounded. German losses during the same period are assessed at approximately 17,000 to 20,000 killed, wounded, and missing, including several thousand taken prisoner during the withdrawal. The recapture of Tikhvin marked the highest operational intensity of the campaign and the decisive moment at which the German attempt to terminate Leningrad's last supply route failed. The rail corridor was damaged but not permanently destroyed. Within days, Soviet engineers began emergency track repair under fire and snow, restoring partial rail traffic before the end of December. The outcome of this peak phase fundamentally altered the strategic balance on the northern sector of the Eastern Front and directly influenced the survival of Leningrad through the winter starvation period that followed. The resistance and adaptation phase following the recapture of Tikhvin unfolded from mid-December 1941 through early January 1942 as both sides adjusted to the new operational reality created by the Soviet success. Although German forces had withdrawn westward from the city, fighting did not cease. Instead, it shifted into a prolonged struggle along the Volkhov River line and the forest corridors leading back toward Muga and Kirishi. The German objective became the stabilization of a shortened defensive front, while the Soviet objective evolved into the securing and expansion of the reopened supply corridor to Leningrad. German formations retreating from Tikhvin reorganized under extreme conditions. Units of the 39th Motorized Corps and supporting infantry divisions established new defensive positions along the western approaches to the Volkhov River. These formations had suffered heavy losses in personnel, artillery, transport, and winter equipment. Several divisions reported combat-ready strength below 60% of authorized levels by late December. Defensive construction relied primarily on field fortifications built directly into snow and frozen ground, supported by limited wooden reinforcement taken from surrounding villages. German adaptation emphasized rigid fire discipline and maximum use of terrain. Forest belts, river bends, and swamp margins were converted into layered defensive zones supported by machine gun nests, trench lines, and small artillery firing points. Due to ammunition scarcity, German artillery abandoned area bombardment in favor of targeted defensive fire against confirmed Soviet attack groupings. Mobile reserves had virtually ceased to exist, forcing German command to rely on static defense rather than maneuver. Soviet forces, having regained Tikhvin, immediately shifted to securing the rail corridor and adapting to sustained winter operations. Railway troops operated under continuous German artillery harassment to restore damaged track segments between Tikhvin and Volkhovstroy. By 20th of December 1941, limited rail traffic resumed, initially at a rate of fewer than 10 supply trains per day. These early deliveries were prioritized for flour, grain, medical supplies, and ammunition destined for Leningrad. Even this restricted flow marked the first restoration of a stable overland supply line to the city since early November. Soviet tactical adaptation focused on reducing exposure during further attacks westward. Infantry assaults increasingly relied on infiltration through forest zones rather than mass frontal movement. Ski detachments and mobile reconnaissance groups probed German defensive depth, identifying weak sectors for limited objective night attacks. Artillery preparation was shortened but intensified at specific breakthrough points to compensate for reduced ammunition availability. Civilian adaptation inside and around Tikhvin followed a different trajectory. After the German withdrawal, Soviet authorities began emergency food distribution using the first restored rail deliveries. Survivors were evacuated eastward to reduce pressure on local resources. Medical teams documented widespread frostbite, malnutrition, and untreated wounds among civilians who had endured the occupation and the peak fighting period. Housing loss across the urban area exceeded 50%, leaving thousands without shelter in sub-zero temperatures. Psychological conditions diverged sharply between the two armies. For German troops, the loss of Tikhvin marked a strategic reversal. that contradicted earlier expectations of permanently sealing Leningrad's fate. Morale suffered further as soldiers became aware of the failure of the Moscow offensive and the growing stabilization of multiple Soviet fronts. Discipline remained intact, but confidence in decisive victory in the north diminished significantly. For Soviet forces, the recapture of Tikhvin had a measurable psychological effect. It represented one of the earliest operational reversals imposed on German forces in the northern sector since the start of the invasion. While losses had been severe, the reopening of the rail corridor was interpreted by Soviet command as proof that the German siege system could be broken under winter conditions. This perception influenced subsequent Soviet planning for further offensives along the Volkhov front. By early January 1942, the resistance and adaptation phase gradually settled into a pattern of positional winter warfare. German defenses west of Tikhvin held, but they no longer threatened the rail lifeline. Soviet forces continued to expand their security buffer along the corridor while preparing for larger operations aimed at reducing the entire siege system around Leningrad. The battle had moved beyond survival alone and entered a stage where its outcome began shaping the next strategic shift in the northern theater. The turning point of the Battle of Tikhvin emerged not as a single moment of collapse, but as a chain of operational consequences that unfolded between mid-December 1941 and the first weeks of January 1942. With the recapture of Tikhvin on 13th December and the partial restoration of the rail corridor, the strategic balance around Leningrad shifted in a way that German command could no longer reverse through local counteraction. What had been a temporary Soviet success became a permanent disruption of the German plan to isolate the city completely. By 18th of December 1941, Soviet railway troops restored continuous single-track movement between Volkhovstroy and Tikhvin under winter emergency standards. Although the line operated at reduced capacity due to damaged switches, destroyed sidings, and constant artillery interference, it enabled the movement of essential freight toward the Lake Ladoga supply hub. Between 20th December and 10th of January, more than 300 supply trains moved along the restored corridor, delivering flour, grain, coal, medical equipment, and ammunition for onward transport across the frozen lake. This flow did not eliminate shortages inside Leningrad, but it stabilized the logistics system at a critical threshold. German attempts to re-interdict the corridor failed. Between 16 and 30 December, artillery fire and limited infantry probes were conducted against rail repair zones south of Tikhvin and near the Volkhov River crossings. These efforts achieved temporary disruption lasting several hours to a day at most, but no sustained break in traffic. Luftwaffe interdiction attempts were constrained by weather, fuel shortages, and increasing Soviet air defense density along the corridor. German air units in the sector averaged fewer than 20 effective sorties per day by late December, insufficient to suppress continuous rail movement. The inability to close the rail line marked the irreversible failure of the German operational concept in the eastern Leningrad sector. By January 1942, German command documented that the minimum logistical flow sustaining Leningrad had been re-established beyond their capacity to sever it again without a major new offensive. Such an offensive was no longer feasible after the failure of the Moscow operation and the mounting crisis across the entire Eastern Front. For the Soviet side, the restoration of the Tikhvin corridor altered strategic planning at the highest level. The defense of Leningrad shifted from emergency survival to a containment and gradual counter-pressure posture. The city was no longer exclusively dependent on the later ice road across Lake Ladoga, which would only become fully operational at maximum capacity later in the winter. Instead, the rail connection created a layered supply system that reduced vulnerability to single-axis disruption. The turning point was also reflected in force redistribution. In late December 1941, Soviet command began reallocating limited reserves from the Tikhvin sector to the central front near Moscow, confident that German forces west of the Volkhov lacked the strength to renew a decisive eastern push. German forces, by contrast, were compelled to abandon all eastward offensive preparations and adopt a permanently defensive posture along the Volkhov line. Civilian consequences mirrored this strategic shift. By early January 1942, bread deliveries into Leningrad stabilized sufficiently to allow a limited increase in daily rations for selected worker categories. While mass starvation continued through the winter, mortality growth slowed compared to the catastrophic peak of November and early December. This statistical change marked the first measurable demographic impact of the Tikhvin reversal. The true turning point of the battle was therefore not only the physical liberation of a railway junction, but the collapse of the German strategy aimed at terminating Leningrad's existence through isolation. From January 1942 onward, the siege evolved into a prolonged confrontation rather than a countdown to exhaustion. German forces retained their positions around the city, but the possibility of forcing its collapse through supply denial alone had been decisively eliminated. From this moment forward, the fate of Leningrad no longer depended solely on endurance against starvation, but increasingly on the ability of the Red Army to dismantle the siege system through future operations. Tikhvin had transformed the strategic equation in the north. The blockade remained, but the scenario of inevitable collapse had been replaced by one of prolonged resistance and eventual counteroffensive. The aftermath and withdrawal phase of the Battle of Tikhvin unfolded from mid-January into February 1942, as German forces completed their repositioning west of the Volkhov River and Soviet command consolidated the reopened supply corridor to Leningrad. Although large-scale offensive action around Tikhvin had ceased with the German evacuation of the city, the wider operational consequences continued to develop across the northern sector of the Eastern Front. Following their withdrawal from Tikhvin between 12 and 15 December 1941, German formations established a new defensive line running roughly along the western bank of the Volkhov River and through forest belts south of Kirishi and Mia. These positions were constructed under winter field conditions with frozen ground limiting the depth of entrenchment. German infantry divisions in this sector averaged between 6,000 and 7,000 combat-ready personnel by January 1942, compared to authorized strengths of more than 15,000. Artillery availability declined sharply, with many batteries operating at fewer than 40% of standard gun strength due to losses, mechanical failures, and ammunition shortages. German command abandoned all plans for renewed eastward offensives toward the Ladoga rail approaches. Instead, operational priorities shifted towards stabilizing the front, protecting remaining communication routes to Maya, and maintaining defensive contact with neighboring formations holding the southern approaches to Leningrad. Fuel allocations were restricted almost entirely to essential transport and limited counterattack capacity. Luftwaffe activity in the sector declined further as air units were redirected to support operations near Moscow and later toward the southern front. On the Soviet side, the recovery of Tikhvin initiated a major logistical reorganization. Railway troops expanded track repair westward toward Volkovstroy, increasing rail capacity steadily through January. By the end of the month, the restored line supported 20 to 25 supply trains daily moving toward the Ladoga hub. From there, supplies were transferred onto the frozen lake routes for transport into Leningrad. This multi-layered system significantly reduced the risk of total disruption from localized German interdiction. Soviet forces gradually transitioned from emergency offensive operations into defensive consolidation along the Volkhov front. Several rifle divisions that had suffered heavy losses during the counteroffensive were withdrawn into second-line positions for reorganization. Replacement drafts from the interior and from newly mobilized cohorts began to replenish frontline units. By February 1942, Soviet troop strength along the Volkhov sector exceeded 280,000 men, though many units remained short of trained junior officers and experienced specialists. Civilian conditions in Tikhvin during the aftermath reflected the cumulative impact of occupation, combat, and winter exposure. Soviet authorities evacuated large segments of the remaining population eastward to reduce pressure on food supplies. Reconstruction of basic public services proceeded under emergency measures. By early February, Limited electrical generation and water pumping had been restored, but housing damage remained extensive, with more than half of all residential structures rendered uninhabitable. Inside Leningrad, the stabilization of the supply system gradually translated into measurable, though modest, improvements. Bread rations for workers increased incrementally in January and February 1942. While civilian mortality from starvation remained severe through the winter, daily death rates began to decline compared to the catastrophic peaks recorded in November and December 1941. Medical deliveries via the restored rail corridor and the ice road contributed to this reduction, though shortages in heating fuel and sanitary infrastructure remained acute. On the German side, the failure at Tikhvin forced a reassessment of operational priorities in the north. Army Group North abandoned its strategy of complete isolation of Leningrad through inland rail interdiction. Instead, the siege became a holding operation designed to tie down Soviet forces, while German resources were redirected toward stabilizing the front around Moscow and preparing for renewed operations in the south. This strategic shift marked the formal end of Germany's last realistic opportunity to force Leningrad's collapse through encirclement alone. By late February 1942, the battlefield around Tikhvin had largely fallen silent, apart from routine artillery exchanges and patrol engagements. The front stabilized into a winter stalemate that would persist until renewed Soviet offensives later in the year. The Battle of Tikhvin had ended not with a dramatic surrender or encirclement, but with a decisive alteration of the logistical and strategic balance that ensured the survival of the besieged city. What followed was no longer a question of whether Leningrad would fall, but how long the siege would continue and at what cost. The withdrawal phase closed one of the most critical chapters of 1941, replacing the scenario of imminent collapse with a prolonged struggle whose final resolution would require years of sustained operations across the entire northern front. The long-term legacy of the Battle of Tikhvin extended far beyond its immediate tactical outcome and became one of the defining logistical and strategic events of the northern theater of the Eastern Front. By preventing the permanent severance of Leningrad's final inland supply route in the autumn of 1941, the operation directly influenced the duration, structure, and ultimate outcome of the siege. From December 1941 onward, the survival of the city was no longer dependent on a single fragile transport axis, but on a layered system combining the restored rail corridor and seasonal transport across Lake Ladoga. From a strategic perspective, Tikhvin marked the failure of Germany's last operational attempt in 1941 to collapse Leningrad through supply interdiction alone. After December 1941, Army Group North lacked both the manpower and the logistical resources required for renewed large-scale offensive operations east of the Volkhov. The December counteroffensive demonstrated the feasibility of sustained large-unit maneuver under extreme cold, forested terrain, and limited infrastructure. Soviet forces refined coordination between infantry, artillery, and logistics units under winter conditions, experience that would later be applied across multiple fronts. The integration of railway troops directly into frontline operational planning became standard practice after Tikhvin. Civilian consequences formed a central element of the battle's historical legacy. While Tikhvin did not end starvation in Leningrad, it altered the statistical trajectory of civilian mortality. Between September and December 1941, Leningrad recorded the highest monthly death rates of the entire siege. From January 1942 onward, mortality rates gradually declined as minimum subsistence deliveries stabilized. By preserving Leningrad's connection to the interior at the moment of its greatest vulnerability, the battle ensured that the siege became a prolonged confrontation rather than a terminal operation. Its legacy is measured not in territorial gain, but in the continuity of resistance that it made possible.